I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Putin gathers world leaders in Russia, we ask why the UN Secretary-General is on the guest list. And, further to the battlefield updates, consider the implications of artificial intelligence being used in the next generation of drones.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 22nd of October, 2 years and 247 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started, as ever, by asking Dom for the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia.
So not very much movement on the ground in Russia or Ukraine. However, Ukrainian Air Force says it shot down 46 of 60 Shahed-type drones launched last night. 10 more were lost, which we think means brought down by electronic warfare. 3 others turned tail and went back towards Russia, and another one last seen heading into Belarusian airspace. Now, elsewhere, 3 people, including a child, were killed in Sumy. 3 killed, 19 injured by a Russian missile in Zaporizhia, and there were more civilian casualties in Donetsk, Kharkiv and Kherson Oblasts. A total of 10 killed, 42 injured across the country yesterday. Miraculously low levels, but I don't mean to sound like it's just a football score I'm reading out. These are obviously, each and every one of them is a life. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry said its air defences had destroyed 11 Ukrainian drones over Bryansk Oblast, 3 over Belgorod Oblast, 2 over Kursk, 1 over Tula and 1 over Orel Oblast last night. We've no way of verifying that, but something obviously got through, because Russian authorities also said earlier today that Ukrainian drones had hit 4 alcohol distilleries in Tula, Tambov and Voronezh Oblasts last night. Those areas are all in between Ukraine and Moscow. So in Tambov Oblast, Governor Maxim Egorov said that a Ukrainian drone strike had set fire to the Baikim distillery in the towns of Razkazovo. That's 400 kilometres northeast of Kharkiv. Now, according to the Baikim website, it produces products of strategic importance for the state, in particular ethanol, a solvent which is used in the manufacture of a wide range of products, including explosives. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. So it looks like Ukraine going after precursor chemicals for explosives rather than just trying to ruin Russia's love affair with alcohol. But, a happy byproduct maybe. Ukrainian officials said yesterday that Russian troops had executed 2 unarmed Ukrainian prisoners of war near Selidove in Donetsk Oblast last Friday by shooting them at point-blank range whilst restrained. There is footage on social media that you really don't need to look at, but it shows these people clearly under control, no longer resisting, and then shot. The Donetsk Regional Prosecutor's Office said that during an attack on Ukrainian positions on Friday, Russian forces captured these 2 individuals, forced them face down, and later shot them at close range. The Ukrainian Ombudsman, Dmitry Lubinets, says he's informed the UN and the Red Cross to keep the record going there. That takes the tally of prisoners of war Russian forces have executed to at least 104 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Those data come from Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office. Now, as we were on air yesterday, Francis, when US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin arrived in Kyiv, as I said, it was a very sprightly exit from the train. He sort of leapt onto the platform, but he styled it out. Later on, after his meetings, he announced a new $400 million military aid package for Ukraine. That includes additional HIMARS ammunition, 155 or 105 mil artillery ammunition, mortar systems and rounds, I think of all natures, 60, 80 and 120 mil, I think, off the top of my head, but lots of different mortar systems, anti-armour systems, including TOW and Javelin. TOW stands for Tube-Launched, Optically Tracked, Wire-Guided. It's a missile that the firer controls via a fibre optic cable that comes out the back of the missile as it sort of wiggles down range, technical term. Javelin is the shoulder-launched anti-tank missile. Other things included M113 armoured personnel carriers, and there were other bits and bobs, ammunition, small arms ammunition, and what have you. Now, today, you may see, last one for me, you may see an announcement that G7 nations have agreed to provide Ukraine with $50 billion worth of cash, 39 billion pounds equivalent. This is a loan to be repaid using profits on frozen Russian assets. We've talked about this a number of times in recent months. This is part of the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Scheme. This is loans to Ukraine. The UK, for its bit, is going to gift £2.25 billion. It's understood the UK is going to have a veto over what military equipment that money can be spent on, with value for money considered to be a key part of any decision. I don't know if each nation gifting that money, or not gifting the money, but arranging for the money to be taken off loans, taken off assets held in their countries, will also have a similar veto. But in addition to the £2.26 billion, the EU has confirmed it's going to be sending €35 billion. That's about 29 billion quid, 35 billion US dollars. Canada has announced 5 billion Canadian dollars. That's about 3.5 billion US dollars. Japan and the US have made contributions, but the size has not yet been announced. Announcing this yesterday, Rachel Reeves, Britain's Chancellor, said this new money is in Britain's national interest because the front line of our defence, the defence of our democracy and shared values, is in the Ukrainian trenches. A safe and secure Ukraine is a safe and secure United Kingdom. Now, the US has been pushing for this kind of scheme to get off the ground for quite a while, but there's been a number of countries very nervous at the precedent it might set in international law. They're concerned that their own assets may be frozen for various reasons decided by other people, external bodies, but they managed to get it over the line. Chancellor Reeves said, "We're using the extraordinary profits from the assets, and that's why we're confident that we can do this within all the right legal frameworks." So as you can tell, there's a lot of sort of legal jiggery-pokery, and that's why it's taken a little bit of time to get to this point. But we're confident that this is both legal and that money will flow back in. Now, the term extraordinary profits refers to gains resulting from transactions that are not part of day-to-day business and trading. You may remember, that's the news. Okay, hold that thought for a moment. Now, you may remember in December 2023, Estonia came up with a defence proposal for cash, providing money to Ukraine, not necessarily from frozen assets, but just from national exchequers, based on the premise that the combined GDP of members of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, occasionally called or more often referred to as the Ramstein Group, is €47 trillion, and that the combined defence budgets of the Ramstein Group is 13 times bigger than Russia's. Defence budget of the Ramstein Group being €1.24 trillion against €0.09 trillion. Now that's 2023 figures. Obviously, Russia's defence budget's gone up a little bit since then, but not massive in terms of that ratio. So if this war becomes a long-term attritional defence industrial and economic fight, which it looks like it is, Russia should lose big and lose fast if the Ramstein countries show political will. So back to that Estonian plan, they called for Ramstein countries to commit 0.25% of GDP annually for military aid to Ukraine. They said that would raise €120 billion a year. And of course, it's important to have not only cash here and now in this year, but to have the guaranteed cash over future years so that you can plan for it and you can budget it and you can build infrastructure and you build factories to make stuff if you know the money's going to be there. So set against that, this new loan of €50 billion, and when we say loan, of course, it's very unlikely to be repaid because it's being taken from the interest on Russian assets. But this new loan of €50 billion is good, almost half that requirement, 120 billion according to Estonia. But, and here is the but. I spoke to MOD, Ministry of Defence here in London, and the Treasury in London here this morning to say, that's good. And these assets, as long as they still exist, these Russian assets, can you sort of skim off the interest each year? Is this going to be a multi-year thing, €50 billion a year? No. Turns out it's for this year only, spread over multiple years. Now, after a bit of back and forth with the Treasury press officer here, I got the following quote. They said the $50 billion will bring forward the profit stream over multiple years. This can't be repeated annually, as the profits will repay these loans over multiple years. Now, that wasn't the clearest answer, but I take it to mean it's a one-off. $50 billion this year from the frozen Russian assets on this, what's the fund called again? ERA, the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Scheme. I'm not turning my nose up at $50 billion, but I just wish they would have been clearer and said that it was a one-off spread over a number of years and what that shape of the money might look like. And also why, if they are frozen, if you've taken the leap to say you're going to use the interest from frozen assets, if those assets still exist, then why can't you use it year on year? But, I did my best, asked the Treasury, and they eventually came up with that answer. So it sounds like $50 billion in the bag, but that's it for now, Francis. And that's us up to date.
Thanks, Dom. A few billion quid would be rather nice, wouldn't it? I know what you do with it, open an Italian in Kyiv next to the dog sanctuary. But as you say, the collective West does continue to fund Ukraine's resistance to Putin's invasion. Meanwhile, and I can't quite believe I'm saying this, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is set to attend the BRICS summit of developing nations hosted in Russia this week, where Putin will welcome the leaders of more than 24 countries, including Xi of China and Modi of India. Now, as we wrote in our editorial a day or so ago, for those who imagined that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the well-attested war crimes that its forces have committed there would see the aggressor become an international pariah, the attendance of the head of the UN is a massive symbolic disappointment, to put it mildly. For the Ukrainians, it must be utterly perplexing as well as infuriating to see the head of the leading international body, one that has condemned the invasion as illegal, attending such a gathering. In March 22, the General Assembly of the UN demanded that Russia immediately cease its unlawful use of force against Ukraine. Now, this summit will be the biggest Russia has hosted since that invasion and will clearly be used by the Kremlin to emphasise that Western attempts to isolate Moscow have failed. Putin, of course, is restrained from travelling because of that warrant for his arrest being issued by the International Criminal Court. He won't be able to attend the G20 in Brazil next month. Instead, the same people have seemingly beaten a path to his door, and he'll be hailing this as a diplomatic coup. Furthermore, Guterres declined Ukraine's invitation to the first Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. Many people are asking, how can he possibly give Putin the kudos he seeks from this conference? Russia has conducted a war with no concern for international law or international bodies' verdicts whatsoever. Yet the head of the foremost international body, which more than any other is supposed to maintain peace and international law, is going there and is scheduled to be meeting Putin one-on-one. It is extraordinary, but perhaps not surprising. Now, that is not to say that this summit isn't important. It is, and we will be covering it in great detail because of its inevitable significance. But we're journalists, not leaders of the organisation which is supposed to maintain the rules-based order. It is worth remembering too that one of the main purposes of BRICS is to build an alternative economic bloc to the West, even though nations like Turkey, which is in NATO, are also attending, despite the fact that they're contributing to Kyiv's defence. It is, therefore, in Moscow and Beijing's interest to push this narrative that the emerging economies are firmly in their sphere of influence, which is another reason why it is significant that the UN Secretary-General is seemingly mandating that perspective by his attendance at the conference, which is designed to push that narrative. And one has to wonder whether that worldview that those countries propagate is conducive to world peace. Many would argue not. The fact is, too, that those countries that are going, and they do represent almost half of the world's population when you include India and China in there, cannot be placed simply under one banner, as entities like BRICS seek to do. As a recent report backed by the former UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has argued this week, Western governments should be careful about the mentalities that are put forward by terms that are often used by BRICS and around BRICS, such as Global South. He questions that as a foreign policy and strategic framework. He says in this report by Policy Exchange that really that term has no basis in historical, economic or political reality, but instead reflects a worldview which delegitimises the global order and, more importantly, is being exploited by Russia and China to weaken the West. Recommendations from that think tank include developing new regional strategies instead, among other things. Not everyone will agree with that, but one does have to wonder why that term has suddenly, in no time at all really, received such prominence and who benefits from it. Now, in other news, I know you covered the Moldovan elections in detail yesterday, and several Western leaders have gone on to condemn Russian interference, hence why I wanted to just do a very quick update on it. Miguel Berger, Germany's ambassador to the UK, who we interviewed on the podcast a few months ago, has tweeted, and I quote, "Germany condemns the blatant attempts by Russian disinformation campaigns to manipulate the democratic elections in Moldova. If the expectation was to derail the referendum on EU accession, it failed. But this should be a warning about the risks of foreign interference." Now, that vote on the referendum did narrowly pass in Moldova, which will come as a relief to many, but it underscores the degree to which countries like Moldova and Georgia, which has its upcoming election, those so-called grey zones because they're not in the EU or NATO, are battlegrounds for Russia's ambitions to regain aspects of its Soviet sphere. One final thought on the narrow result of the vote too is there was some commentary suggesting that there may well have been more pro-EU voters who didn't actually vote in favour of the referendum that was put forward in this vote, for the simple fact that they opposed the changes that it sought to do to the constitution. What percentage of voters that may have been is very, very hard to say, but I just thought I would mention it as yet another example of the nuance that's required when we're talking about some of these issues. Now, next, the latest on the North Korean troops in Europe. That wasn't on my bingo card for 2024, I have to say. The new NATO chief, Mark Rutte, has said that sending such troops to fight in Russia's war would mean, in that common phrase, a significant escalation. And he just had a conversation with the South Korean president, who has summoned the Russian envoy to South Korea to discuss this matter. This story is more evidence, I think, of the simple fact that Western fears not to do anything that could escalate the war are themselves proving to be escalatory, as Moscow and its allies take that as a blank check to do more as they please. The Kremlin called the North Korean troop reports contradictory, but tellingly stopped short of any denials. Apparently, Russian authorities detained 18 North Korean soldiers who abandoned their positions in Kursk. So it would seem that the stories from Ukraine about North Korean defectors was true, but there's just too much speculation at the moment to definitely say one way or the other. Now, Lithuania's Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis told Politico that in response, it's urgent for European countries to revisit Macron's idea of deploying troops to Ukraine. But I still can't see the appetite unless matters are seen to come increasingly desperate on the battlefield. The underexplored impact of this, as Mick Ryan has stressed, is that the North Koreans will learn much from their involvement with the Russians. Their army was totally untested for decades. No experience whatsoever. Now they will be sharing lessons on modern combat, particularly the integrated use of drones, cruise and ballistic missiles, and something that will be of great interest to North Korea, which is how it can potentially use missile technology to keep the South Korean capital and US bases in Korea permanently at threat. There'll also be lessons about electronic warfare, countering air defences, and all of those sorts of things, which will no doubt be high on their agenda. That could well have major implications longer term for the Pacific theatre, which underscores, again, how Russia's success in Ukraine has a toxifying ripple effect globally, and it is impossible to separate what is happening in Ukraine from broader defence concerns in the international sphere. But that's enough from me. Now, over, of course, to Hamish, Bretton-Gordon. With both of you on today, it's like our very own Dad's Army reunion, isn't it? But Hamish, you've been listening to what we were talking about there, and I know you've got your own thoughts as well on some of these issues. But first of all, where do you want to start?
Good afternoon, chaps. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I go into those points, I rather like your analogy, Francis, on us being a Dad's Army team. I'm not sure if Dom or I are Mannering or Wilson. Francis, maybe don't tell him your name. But if I could start with what you have just been talking about, two things very close to my heart, the United Nations and chemical weapons. But I don't want to repeat what you said, Francis, and you're absolutely spot on, and I agree with it. I would say, I'm not a Telegraph journalist as such. I write for the Telegraph. I'm an opinion maker. So these are my opinions, not necessarily the opinions of a balanced journalist working for somebody like the BBC or elsewhere. When it comes to Guterres, Antonio Guterres, the current head of the UN, I wrote exactly 12 months ago to this day in the Telegraph that the man should resign if he had any moral compass. I just remind people of the UN Charter, which mandates that the United Nations and its member states are to maintain international peace and security, uphold international law, achieve higher standards of living for their citizens, address economic, social, health and related issues, and promote universal respect and observance of human rights. So with Guterres seeming to be Putin's lapdog, and some would say that Guterres is in his position because of Putin. Putin lent on the UN to do that some years ago. For him to scuttle off to Kazan in Russia to join a pretty unsavory group, Iran et al., and those other countries that are rather too fond of the cheap hydrocarbons that Putin is fueling his war machine, to me really is damning. And you've talked that he didn't go to the first Ukraine peace summit. But also to me on the chemical side, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is the United Nations organisation that polices the United Nations Chemical Weapons Convention. Now, Guterres should be dragging Putin to the International Criminal Court to answer those issues around the Salisbury Novichok attack, which I'll weave into in a minute, the massive use of chemicals in Ukraine. And instead, he appears to be going to see the indicted war criminal who can't go anywhere because he knows that he would be arrested. So pretty unsavoury.
Dom, given that we're talking about this, and you've also been very vocal in the last few years about the UN, whether you had any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Hi, Hamish. I mean, look, unless he's pulling a blinder here and he's laying his reputation on the altar of realistically trying to influence Putin, then I just can't see this as anything other than being particularly weak and capitulation. Now, I get bashed a lot. People say, you don't understand how the UN works. Fine, please. I want to learn here. So those people who message me each time I rabbit on about the UN and say, you just got no idea, you're being hopelessly naive, tell me why this is either a good look, or if you don't want to go that far, tell me why this is not a bad look for Antonio Guterres to go off and see Putin and all the others. But what I think it does show, if this is the correct, and we don't know yet, maybe he's not going to go. If this is as we've been speculating, I think what it shows is that we, the vast majority of people listening to this, that want Ukraine to win here, we are on our own. There's no supranational organisation that's going to stand up for the post-war settlement, post-Second World War settlement and the rule of law. We are on our own. Fine. It's up to us to stay informed, to support each other, to challenge Russian narratives when we see and read them, and lobby our national leaders, because there's no one else going to come to the rescue. So I think far from this being a moment of despair, I think we should view this as a helpful moment of clarity. We know what the UN is now. We know who Antonio Guterres is. If this plays out as we think, it's a moment for us to mark and act upon. From the mind of Marge, Francis.
Well, thanks, Tom. I just wanted to bring you in there because I know, as you say, you've got strong opinions on this. But Hamish, back to you then. Chemical weapons. Where do you want to start on this?
Yeah, okay, absolutely. And some of you, a lot of you know Jimmy Rushton, writes frequently for the Telegraph and a friend to the pod. Jimmy posted a video yesterday showing a Russian drone dropping a chloropicrin grenade on Ukrainian trenches. Very vivid. And I say it because it really shows to those who maybe cannot visualize what it's like, this sort of chemical warfare. I saw very similar when I was with the Peshmerga fighting ISIS back in 2016, when ISIS dropped chlorine mortars on us. You can actually see this stuff, this clouds of chloropicrin in the case of what's happening in Ukraine, and yellow and green chlorine that ISIS fired at us. So it's very vivid. You can see it. I've done a piece with Forces News, BFBS, British Forces Broadcasting Service, which ostensibly is aimed at the military community and veteran community, but there's some great stuff on there. And the vid, if it's not appearing in the Telegraph, that video will be on Forces News on the web. But it's very vivid and shows what is happening. Now, this is a single incident, but this is happening, has happened thousands and thousands of times. I've been speaking to some of the brigades recently. It's happening 2 or 3 times a day. I link it to the Salisbury poisonings inquiry, which has been going on for a week. And it's sort of interlinked. I mentioned the organisation of the prohibition of chemical weapons and the Russians. In my opinion, Putin saw what was happening in Syria when I was in Syria, helping medical staff deal with these things, massive use of chlorine by barrel bombs, by the Assad regime, dropping them on civilian areas, which they couldn't take conventionally. One of my sort of rather cynical lines is, these weapons are brilliant if you have no morals or scruples. Some of the people we're talking about here, absolutely Assad and Putin, appear to have no morals or scruples, so are using these things. My concern, we've talked a lot about the nuclear threats, which I have sort of dismissed, and very happy to argue that the sort of toss on that, why they are irrelevant. But on the chemical side, I'm slightly more concerned. I think the WMD, to call it, for want of a better word, that we should be concerned about probably in Ukraine is probably on the chemical side. If you think that chloropicrin, which is a choking agent, a riot control agent, but it's bloody unpleasant if anybody's sort of had a sniff of it, and if you're fighting in a trench and want to keep your head down and that stuff's thrown at you, then it is really, really difficult. And that's why it's having such an impact. But we sort of discussed that before. But, on a toxicity scale, if chloropicrin is 1, Novichok, which is the nerve agent used in Salisbury, from where I'm talking to you, would be 100,000. That is one of the callous things. There is no doubt that the Russian Secret Service, GRU, were responsible for that attack in Salisbury to kill the double agent Sergei Skripal. They hit him, but he survived. Very sadly, a local civilian, Dawn Sturgis, was killed by the Novichok. But it's it's the most toxic probably material man has ever made, and it's made by the Russians, and they probably still have a program. So if they're prepared to use industrial amounts of chloropicrin, I'm concerned that they might escalate, as we've seen a lot of escalation. I'm concerned that the man we've just been talking about, Guterres, and his OPCW, have not been calling the Russians out. Now, at the end of last week, the British government started to sanction some of the Russian military involved in the chemical attacks thus far, the chloropicrin and some of the other agents used. So although this has not yet been proved by the United Nations, again, which is the forum to do it, the British government absolutely believes that the Russians are to blame. And hopefully, a bit like the German government issuing a arrest warrant for President Assad for using chemical weapons in Syria, then maybe that is something that our government could focus on, yet another war crime by Putin, yet another arrest warrant, I think just builds up the pressure on him, and is the way to go. So that is what is concerning me at the moment. I've talked many times on this pod, there's a pretty simple solution, and it's a respirator or a gas mask in common parlance. That would help things. But at the moment, while our eyes are elsewhere, our eyes are at Kazan in Russia, and of course things happening in the Middle East, this is still grinding on in the Donbass, and it's happening every day, and is a war crime, and we need to call it out, even if we're not prepared at this stage to do something. So if you want to see the video and a bit more detail on it, go to the Forces News website. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish, for that. I'm going to bring in Dom in a minute to summarise a story about AI and drones. Very interesting, this, and also keen to hear your reflections on it, Hamish. But before we do that, just wanted to hear your view on the pretty extraordinary fact that North Korean troops are now seemingly fighting on European soil. You're a former military man, and I know you've written a very punchy piece about this in recent days, but you must have been pretty aghast, no?
Absolutely. And as you say, the piece I wrote over the weekend had a phenomenal response. Most of it positive, a few negative from our usual friendly Russian bots. But there are two things that stand out for me about this. 10,000 or 12,000, whatever the number is. That is quite a significant number. Is it because Russia is running out of conscripts? There was a piece, I think, yesterday in the paper that they're still occasionally using over 1,000 soldiers a day, which is unsustainable for a military the size of Russia. So are they now having to go to tyrants like Kim Jong-un to get troops from there? Is that because they don't want to start having to conscript the oligarchs and the wealthy of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and it was their mothers, in inverted commas, who got the Kremlin to withdraw from Afghanistan in the 1980s when too many of their sons were coming back in body bags? So that, to me, is an indicator that Putin is struggling to fill up his army. So that's on the one side. On the other side, what has made Kim Jong-un give lots of missiles to Russia and now, 12,000 of their sons? That seems a very, very big commitment. And my concern is that it's in return for nuclear technology. We know the North Koreans have a missile. We know they have maybe an atomic rather than a hydrogen bomb. And I won't go into the details, but one is slightly less worse than the other. But what we're pretty certain is they don't know how to put them together yet. If that is the quid pro quo as such, then that would severely destabilise, I think, the Far East, and Japan and others will be hugely concerned. The other element to it is that Zelensky last week was talking about rekindling the Ukrainian nuclear capability. And they, of course, before in the early 90s, when the protocols were signed, handed over their nuclear missiles. Again, the whole escalation piece, without wanting to oversimplify the situation, if you have a couple of big dogs with a bone, they can sort of scrap together. If you then introduce other dogs with a bone, you can then create complete mayhem. So I'm rather mixing my metaphors there, but hopefully that you understand. So I think the North Korean thing is, on the one hand, positive for Ukraine because Russia might be running out of troops. On the other hand, what is Kim Jong-un getting out of this? Because he's really made a huge commitment. Over.
Well, thanks, Hamish. We need to stop talking about dogs or Dom will put a pizza in the oven. But Dom, you've been listening to this, and as I said earlier, we want to talk a little bit about AI and drones. So where do you want to start on this story?
Well, it's an observation, really, and I'd appreciate Hamish's view. So I've seen recently a number of sort of social media clips of drones, first-person view drones, that have been filmed by another one or by another drone or airborne asset. And it's clear that the FPV drone loses its signal right at the end, just a few meters away from the target it's going for. That's generally quite normal because at that point it's quite low. It's got to be quite near the ground, so it's generally behind buildings or trees or folds in the earth and what have you. And so the signal back to the pilot is probably going to be degraded. So you'd expect that control and the telemetry, the picture going back, to be slightly fuzzy. And that's why a lot of these strikes we see just before it goes into the turret or the barrel or whatever it's going to attack, we see it all breaking up, but it's quite clear that the drone is going to hit hit the thing it's going for. But recently we've seen, in the last few months, how electronic warfare can then veer the drones off, and so you might see a tank sort of way down there on the ground and it's heading towards it, and then the signal starts going a bit funny, and it's not low enough for that to be impacted by ground clutter, buildings, trees, folds in the earth, and so on and so forth. So it's obviously being impacted by electronic warfare, and it almost certainly then veers off or misses the target. It's very unlikely to just continue a nice sort of parabolic curve down to the target it's going for. However, in the last few days, I've seen quite a few bits of footage whereby the imagery from the drone in question, the first-person view drone, does break up, suggesting it's at a high enough level, high enough altitude to suggest it's being impacted by electronic warfare, but it still manages to hit the target. Now, we spoke about this some months ago, and we were speculating that when will AI-enabled automatic target recognition hit the battlefield? And what I mean by that is, if you tell the drone, as you can do today with some missiles, you tell it what to look for. So it can tell the difference between a shed and a civilian car and a tank. And so the missile, the drone, the munition would say, okay, well, if I lose the signal from my pilot, I know what I'm going for. I'm not going to go and attack that shed because there's no point. I'm not going to attack the civilian car because I'm not Russian. I'm going to go and attack the tank. So the drone then knows, through AI, it can sort of work out, even with all the different angles and different shapes of these things and the different natures of various military equipment, it knows what it's looking for and it knows what to target if the signal is lost. Now, up till now, that kind of technology has not been small enough and light enough to put on FPV drones, or so we thought. And I'm just wondering, be interested in, let's say, Hamish's view here, whether or not this recent spate of imagery suggests that maybe it is now small enough and light enough to fit on FPV drones, so that you've got AI-enabled target recognition, automatic target recognition on first-person view drones. So in the event of a loss of signal, when it's in a sort of terminal guidance phase in the last bit of the attack, if it gets hit with EW, it can still prosecute the target it's going for. It can still hit the target it's going for. I wonder if I've sort of put too many links there, Hamish, and if you've seen something like this, and if you think this kind of AI automatic target recognition is small enough, technically small enough and light enough to go on an FPV drone.
Dom, that's a great observation. For somebody who has trouble switching their mobile phone on, an old fellow like me understanding this sort of stuff, I sort of think back, and you probably know more about this than me. We're so used to satellite navigation and all that sort of stuff, and we've all got our Wazers and our Apple Maps and stuff. But, back in the day when you sort of had inertia navigation systems that were all sort of working on, how fast your track went round and what bits of ground you were going over. And I presume when you were flying your Gazelle around the place, you had sort of some fairly antiquated sort of navigation type systems. And I just wonder whether the sort of reversionary modes of acquiring targets we sort of slightly gone back to. I mean, I was amazed. Somebody gave me a briefing on the Kursk maneuvers a few months ago when Ukrainian forces broke over the border, and the amount of surveillance drones, the amount of attack drones that they had really paving the way and clearing the electronic space, as it were, so that the rather antiquated tanks and all the rest can move forward without being electronically zapped. I mean, to me, that was absolutely fundamental. And I think we've discussed often, this control of the electronic space is key in this sort of environment. And for people who've seen, the sort of drone dancing that you get at sporting events and parties and all the rest of it, seeing all these things go together is just incredible. I was having a chat to somebody the other day who will remain nameless, who's sort of working on the sort of laser technology to take multiple drones down. And again, that is moving at a hell of a pace. But the counter to that is also moving at a hell of a pace. So I haven't really answered your question, Dom, but AI, and I haven't even had a go with ChatGPT yet. And somebody was showing me just the other day, in fact, when we were trying to work out a seating plan for a dinner party we were having, and it came up with absolutely the perfect answer. Things are moving apace. The use of AI for this sort of stuff, I think it is all about, always in warfare, is trying to stay 1 inch ahead of the enemy and keeping going. You cannot stand still. So the progression is outstanding. At the moment, it seems the Ukrainians are just that inch ahead.
Thanks, Hamish. Let's go to our final thoughts then. I'll come to you last as our guest. But just before I do go into the final thoughts and hand over to Dom, it's just one thing on this drones debate, which is Zelensky was very keen to emphasise at Chatham House last week that he felt, I think, vindicated on some of the assessments that he'd made that had led to several raised eyebrows before he was dismissed, namely about the importance of technology and technological innovation for Ukraine. Now, this debate has, of course, lurched back and forward about it being about mass and how many tanks, how many guns we can get to Ukraine versus, it being about game-changing weapons, technological innovations that can mean that Ukraine suddenly has another strategic advantage. He, I think, acknowledges both, but has been more on the side of the argument that technology holds the key. And it'll be very interesting seeing whether this is an area that Ukraine continues to be the pioneer in, and whether it does begin to have decisive ramifications, or even more decisive ramifications on the battlefield. We, of course, have seen how effective it's been against the ammunition depots in Russia, for instance. So it's just an interesting area, and one that, of course, we should and will continue to monitor. And I should say that Joe Barnes, who, of course, is regular on the podcast, our Brussels correspondent, he's in Washington at the moment, hence why he's not been on as much, but he's doing some fantastic work on drones at the moment, and we'll link to his piece in the show notes on that very subject. But Dom, sorry, I stopped myself there. Over to you for final thoughts.
Thanks, Francis. A quickie from me. Promised everyone an update a little while ago. And thanks to Claire from Car for Ukraine. Car for Ukraine does kind of what it says on the tin. Buys, refurbs and sends vehicles, mostly 4x4s, out to troops in Ukraine. They've dedicated one to David, got a nice sticker down the side. I've put it out on my Twitter feed from Car for Ukraine and Claire. So thanks very much for that. Do go and have a look at that. The car with David on it is currently bouncing around somewhere in eastern Ukraine. I think he'd be very happy with that. But do go and have a look at our Twitter feed. And thanks Claire, and thanks Car for Ukraine.
Thanks, Claire. Hamish, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thinking back to your sort of Dad's Army analogy, I think David would rather like that, and I sort of think I know David would be, but I'll leave it there. My sort of final thought is a lot of people in the States listen to the pod, and of course it is the US election coming up in 2 weeks' time. The outcome could have a fundamental impact in the war. For those of us sat this side of the pond, we absolutely hope that you on the other side of the pond are going to keep doing all the fantastic stuff you do to support Ukraine. Let's hope that whatever happens in 2 weeks' time, that unwavering support to Ukraine and NATO continues.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.